Well, good day to everybody. We have joined here again for our devotionals for today. We are on session 10, Genesis 30 and 31. We finished up yesterday with the whole fiasco of Jacob marrying Laban's daughters, Rachel and Leah, and how he wants to marry Leah, who is the younger daughter, and works for 7 years to gain her hand and realizes that it's Leah he's married. And so he works for another 7 years in order to marry Rachel, the one he loves. And so these two sisters, who are the wives of Jacob, actually engage in a competition for Jacob's love and acceptance, and also for children. Now, one of the things I want to, as I begin this, want to reiterate again, as we see this competition to see who can have the most children, particularly sons, why this is important. Children, of course, are important to us, but in this day, back in the ancient Near East, children were critical. They not only, I'm silencing my phone here. You see what happens even in the midst of production. So in this context, what happens is that your heritage is everything, your lineage is everything, your family name is everything, and the way that you continue to secure the future of that lineage is to have children. The other thing is that a lot of these Bedouin tribes, if you will, is what they are, living in clans, and there's not a lot of them, and so in order to guarantee the future survival of the clan, you have to have children. And folks who are knowledgeable in this area will tell you that whether it's people or whether it's animals, you have to have a certain population to in order to have enough of the population to reproduce and sustain the particular species, which is why we have certain animals that are on the endangered list, because there's no longer enough of them, or they're endangered because they're close to that number where they will simply not have enough left in order to sustain the continuation of the species. And so when you don't have that, animals go extinct. So you want to continue, you want your clan to continue, you want your tribe to continue. So children are extremely important. They're also seen as a blessing from God, plain and simple. So we get to the end of chapter 29, and Leah has had 4 sons, 4 of the first 4 sons who will be the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. And Leah, who is the wife who Jacob truly prefers and loves, does not have children. And so she now envies her sister, and we get into this competition. And so what Rachel does is exactly what his grandmother, Sarah, did for Abraham, and that is offer Jacob her maid, Bilhah, as a surrogate mother. And so, and again, in this context, this is not immoral. This is not necessarily unusual. You and I would not only call it adultery, but probably even trafficking in human beings, because Bilhah's a slave. She has no say in this. She doesn't get to consent. She has no choice. And so it's rightfully today not acceptable, although unfortunately it still is a scourge in our midst. But remember, again, God always works within the context of the human situation. So here we have Bilhah, who becomes the surrogate mother, and she conceives, and she gives birth actually to 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali, who will again be 2 more patriarchs of the 12 tribes. And Leah sees this, and of course, she's got to play the game of one-upsmanship. So she then offers Jacob her maid, Zilpah, who also bears two sons, Gad and Asher. So there we go. So the competition continues, perhaps not only for their own sake and their own esteem, but it's also trying to keep in favor with their husband Jacob. So there's something kind of tragic about this. But God is using this, and God will use it. We'll talk a little bit about that as we get to the end. So the story and saga continues of childbearing, and we read, and starting in verse 14, that Reuben, who is a son of Leah, comes to finds mandrakes in the field, and these are plants that were found on the outskirts of farmland, and they were believed to have aphrodisiac properties and also fertility properties. So he finds these, he brings them to his mother Leah, in the hopes that maybe she will also bear more children because of these mandrakes. And Rachel finds out about it and says, I want some of those mandrakes. And Leah said, nope, you can't have any of the mandrakes. You've taken away my husband. I was married, you've taken away my husband. I was married first. You can't have them. And so in a sense, what happens here, it seems, is that Rachel barters for them. And what she barters is interesting to ask. We don't know. But Rachel, being the second wife, and remember, Rachel's the preferred wife, but Leah is the first wife. So Leah really has priority in reference to her husband. And so what Rachel does, in effect, is she barters to get these mandrakes, and what Leah does then is give up her right to priority over her husband in this instance, so that Leah, so that Rachel can then basically spend the night with her husband. And so she buys these mandrakes, she barters for these mandrakes, and verse 16 reads, and I'm going to read the G-rated translation, which is my own translation, and not how the New Revised Standard has it. But when Jacob came in from the field that evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must sleep with me, you must spend the night with me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So basically what she has done is hired her husband for a night with him ahead of the first wife, Leah. And so she does conceive, and she bears a fifth son, names him Issachar. And she, 9 months later, or 10 months or 12 months later, she bears another son, calls him Zebulun. And she bears a daughter, names her Dinah. So 2 things here real quick. This whole story, it's truncated down. So if you read it quickly, it can seem like this is happening quickly. But this story takes place over months. And this is often what happens in the narratives of the Bible, that they're short narratives, but they take place over months and years. And so that's the first thing to note in the passage. Second thing to note is that Dinah is a daughter. She is mentioned. No accolades about bearing a daughter, unfortunately. That's the world that we're reading about here. But Dinah will come into the story later on. So God remembers Rachel, and she conceives a son, and she also names him Joseph. So here we are, and Rachel and Leah are still in the competition for their husband's affections, and also to bear children for the future. So we get done with that kind of competition. And now we move into Jacob and Laban. Again, Jacob has been with Laban for many years. It comes out to be about 20 years. And Jacob just is not making money. He is not increasing his wealth. And the way your wealth is measured is by your flocks and your herds. And so Jacob just can't seem to break even because, at least break even and prosper, because father-in-law Laban is just as crafty and deceptive as his son-in-law Jacob. And so Jacob comes to Laban and he wants to leave. He wants to go back to his home. Laban doesn't want him to leave because Jacob's been good for business, if you will. He's been good for his padding his own pocketbook, we might say. And so he makes a deal with him, and they make a deal, and what Jacob is going to do is going to choose from Laban's flock the spotted animals and the speckled animals, the black animals, which are not considered to be as good as the white sheep. And so Laban figures that he can keep Jacob there, dependent upon him, while Jacob thinks that maybe he can find a way to increase his wealth even by not taking the best of the flock. So they both get into a mode of operation that they try to deceive each other. So what Laban does is he goes out at night, he removes all of the speckled lambs, all of the spotted lambs, all the black lambs from his flock, and pastures them several miles away, out of sight of Jacob. And what Jacob does is he begins a process of breeding. These folks didn't have any sense of genetics the way we do. They really didn't know about dominant and recessive genes, but they knew that if you bred certain kinds of sheep and certain kinds of other sheep and certain lambs with certain lambs, and if you grafted certain trees with other trees and things like that, they knew that you would get a certain product from that a lamb would be, you could count on a lamb being this way or a fruit tree being that way, right? So they understood that. So this is what Jacob starts to do. And again, the story reads quickly, but this is over a long time. And so what happens over time is that Jacob actually prevails, and now he's got a decent flock. Even though they're not all white lambs, he's got this decent flock. And so he is out conniving his father-in-law at this point. Now he does want to leave. He does want to go back to his homeland. He wants to go back to the land of his father and his grandfather. And so instead of going to Laban a second time and trying to plead for that, he just beats it out of Dodge in the middle of the night. He goes to his wives, Rachel and Leah, explains the situation. Rachel and Leah know that their father has taken advantage of their husband and taken advantage of them. And so they consent to this, and off they all go in the middle of the night. Laban finds out about it a few days later. And again, because you're over a rather large stretch of land and everybody's doing their job and taking care of business, it could be a few days before you find out. And so once he's told that his son-in-law has left, he mounts a posse to go after Jacob, and he catches up to him, and they begin to have conversation. And what's really the case is that Laban decides he's just not going to try to bring Jacob back, and so they make a covenant together. This is not the first covenant, right? They make a covenant with each other, basically to say they're going to allow each other to go their separate ways, but be faithful to each other and not lift their hand against each other. It's just a way of coming to peace. And so they set up an altar and they set up a place for this, and they have a feast. And then Jacob moves on his way, and we're told that Jacob flocks and his wealth becomes even better and stronger than Laban's. So he goes on his way. Now, I want to back up for a moment because I want to mention this detail about when Jacob is leaving, that Rachel steals the household gods from her father. And so what are these household gods? Well, they're probably little idols made of stone, perhaps wood. And they would be kept in the house, the tent, whatever it is you're living in. And they would be used for divination. They would be used, you might have a little altar in the house. They would be used to try to discern the will of the God you worshiped. Now, we have to be mindful that in this time, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are probably not what you would call strict monotheists in the sense that we think of it. That is, they believe in only one God, in the existence of only one God. They're probably more henotheists, which means they believe that there are other gods that exist, but their devotion is to only one, and that is to the God of Abraham. Now, this is not a cause for any kind of concern for anybody because God, again, always works within the context of the situation. God reveals as time goes on. Theologians call it progressive revelation. And at some point, Abraham's descendants will come to the knowledge that there is only one God that exists, and that's the God of Israel. But right now, what you've probably got is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob worshiping the one God who has revealed himself to them. But that you have other people who believe in other gods and worship other gods. So that's probably what we have here. Rachel takes the household gods, maybe in an attempt to keep Laban from discovering where they've gone, because he can't now use the gods to determine, to consult, right? So but when Laban gets there and finds Jacob, he goes into the tent of Rachel, who is sitting on the household gods. And this is an example of where later readers would have seen some humor in this story. Remember, the law of Moses hasn't been given yet. That will come later. But the first hearers of these stories, in their final form, would have already had the law of Moses. And so they would have had the law against idolatry, against making graven images, they would have had the laws of clean and unclean, and so that women who are in their time of their cycle of their month are unclean, which means they can't worship, and that anyone who comes in contact with them during this time is unclean. And so here is Rachel sitting on the household gods in this time, making them effectively unclean. And Laban goes into the tent, and Rachel says, "Pardon me if I don't get up because, it's that time and I'm going to stay here away from you." And so this would have caused some later generations some humor, that these household gods in whom Laban trusts are effectively being made unclean by Rachel's actions. So let me sum up a couple of things. And what the first is that, again, we see the dysfunction of families and how that affects later on. And just as is cause for us to think about how our families function and dysfunction and how that reverberates down through the generations. So we see that in the Bible. Another thing we see, again, is God continues to work in ways for and against, and in ways of which even maybe God would not approve, that God continues to work. I want to read a quote here from Dennis Olson, an Old Testament scholar. And here's what he says. He says, "Jacob's human actions and schemes to gain blessing and wealth join implicitly with the hidden working out of God's blessing activity, which God had promised to Jacob. Likewise, the strategies used by Leah and Rachel to have children through their maids or through bartering mandrakes were also ways by which human activity cooperated with God's guidance and work to achieve the blessing of fertility that God had promised. Trusting in God's promises and blessings does not entail passivity, but requires persistent human activity and ingenuity alongside the divine guidance of events. Meaning that in the midst of all of this mess, in the midst of the good things that they do, in the midst of the questionable things that they do that God does not condone, nevertheless, God finds a way to work. God finds a way when there seems to be no way. So it's, again, for us to remember that God will fulfill God's promises, but God wants to use us to fulfill those promises. But God, well, if we're not willing or if we act in certain ways, he'll still find a way without us. And so this is important for all of us this day. All right, friends, we are done with session 10, chapters 30 and 31. Tomorrow we begin with session 11, Genesis 32 through 34. And let me pray us out. Gracious God, thank you again for this day, and thank you for how you continue to work with us. Forgive us for our shortcomings. Forgive us when we have hindered your work, knowing that we cannot stop it, but forgive us when we've hindered it. Help us to be faithful in ways that are pleasing in your sight, that you may use us for your plans in today's world. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, friends, we will see you tomorrow.